It's Sunday, March 23, 2025. I'm Anthony Davis. Welcome to the Weekend Show, where we make the time to consider the news of the week. You can support my work and independent journalism at patreon.com/5 Minute News. Our guest today was the largest foreign investor in Russia until 2005, when he was denied entry to the country and declared a threat to national security for exposing corruption in Russian state-owned companies. Since then, he has sought justice outside of Russia and started a global campaign for governments around the world to impose targeted visa bans and asset freezes on human rights abusers and highly corrupt officials. Sir William Browder, welcome to the Weekend Show.
Thank you.
Bill, there's been a lot of heat on this phone call that finally came between Donald Trump and Vladimir Putin this last week. It's said that Putin kept Trump waiting for an hour, which we can only assume is an old KGB trick, or maybe he just was playing games. But the transcript of Donald Trump's phone call and the transcript of Vladimir Putin's phone call that was, put out through the official media are actually quite different. So who are we to believe here? And would you agree that Donald Trump really did not have any success with Putin in this call?
Well, first of all, there was no transcript. I guess you're sort of using that term loosely.
Yeah.
What we have is sort of an interpretation of the two calls, and I would say that both interpretations are probably not true. What we know for sure, and what we can look at for objectively, is that about a week ago, under intense pressure and browbeating, Vladimir Zelensky met with the Secretary of State, Marco Rubio, and Steve Witkoff, Trump's special envoy, and he agreed to an unconditional ceasefire for 30 days, during which time, in theory, there could be more substantive negotiations about ending the war. And so after that, the onus was on Putin. Would he agree to an unconditional ceasefire? At which point, then there could be a discussion about ending the war. And so everybody then said, balls in Putin's court. What's he going to do? And as you mentioned, there was this strange situation where instead of taking a call with the most powerful man in the free world to discuss ending a war which has devastated his country, Putin decided to postpone it for an hour while having a chat with a bunch of Russian businessmen at the Union of Industrialists conference in Moscow. So they go into this call, and what we know for sure happened is that Putin did not agree to the unconditional ceasefire for 30 days so they could have a more substantive discussion. What Putin agreed to was using the word ceasefire to say that he would do a ceasefire on a very specific, narrow target, which is energy infrastructure. And even that narrow target is the point of contention, because nobody knows exactly what that means. Is it energy and infrastructure or energy infrastructure? In any event, for all intents and purposes, Putin rejected the proposal. That's what we need to know. It's these readouts about whether it was a good meeting or a bad meeting, or whether they talked for an hour and a half, is all irrelevant. What we know is that Zelensky agreed to a ceasefire. Putin did not. Trump was not able to get Putin to do that. And here we are.
I mean, obviously, Donald Trump sells himself as the great deal maker. He's really set himself up to fail here, hasn't he? Because before the election, he was like, I can end this war in 24 hours. I can end it even before I'm elected. And in reality, none of that is going to happen. Do you think Putin does want this war to end? Because there's kind of a mixed reaction as to whether or not he really does.
No, Putin does not want this war to end. And it's very important to understand why Putin is doing this in his own mind. The reason why Putin started this war is not because Russia was being, quote, encircled by NATO. It's not because Russia needs any more territory. If you look on a world map, how much territory Russia has, Ukraine is a tiny sliver of what Russia already possesses. The reason that Putin started this war is that he's been in power for, at the time he started the war, 22 years. During that time, he's run a kleptocracy of all kleptocracies. And what that means is that he and the people around him, about 1,000 people around him, stole $1 trillion from the Russian state. This is money that should have been spent on hospitals, schools, and public services. Instead, it was spent on private jets, yachts, and villas in the south of France. And Putin understood very clearly that at some point, the Russian people would no longer tolerate that. Even if Russia is not a democracy, and it's definitely not a democracy, at some point, there'll be 1 million people with pitchforks on Red Square storming the gates of the Kremlin if he carried on with that. And as a man whose main purpose is personal survival, what did Putin do to make sure that there weren't 1 million people with pitchforks on Red Square? He created a foreign enemy, Ukraine, and he started a war. That's what this war is about. It's about a war. It's a war about a little man, who's stolen too much money, who's desperately afraid of being killed by his own people, and needs to create a distraction and a foreign enemy. And the reason why any attempts to negotiate with him to give him things to end the war aren't going to work is because he doesn't want those things. What he wants is to stay in power and stay alive. And that's not something that Donald Trump or any other head of state can give him. And that's why he's going to continue at this war. And that's why he has these demands and maximalist objectives which are unsatisfiable.
We should probably remind our viewers of the propaganda that Putin is putting out in Russia to describe Ukrainians as Nazis and that they have, that they are the baddies and, the Russians are the goodies. Could you just talk to that for a moment? Because I don't think people really realize how he's positioned Zelensky and Ukraine.
So he needed to explain to the Russian people why he's doing this war. And then, by the way, he doesn't call it a war. He calls it a special military operation.
Right. That's yes.
And the reason he calls it a special military operation as opposed to a war is that he doesn't want the Russian people to feel like it's touching them in any way. And if it's a special military operation, it's something that's going off in some distant place. It's a special operation. It's not a all-encompassing war. And by the way, if you call it a war in Russia, you're not allowed to. It's against the law. And if you're found to have done so, you go to jail for 8 years. They're very, very sensitive about this. But in advance of this special military operation, they had to somehow convince the Russian people that this was a righteous operation, that it made sense, because generally there's no beef between the Ukrainians and the Russians. They're all intermarried. They get along. They're all Slavic. There's nothing that distinguishes them all that much, other than the fact that in Ukraine they have democracy and in Russia they don't. But what Putin needed to do was to explain to the Russian people that these are bad people. And how does he do that? He says, well, these are all Nazis. And we need to run an anti-Nazi operation, because there's Nazis that don't like Russian people, and they're going to kill Russian children and rape Russian women. And we need to stop this Nazi ethnic cleansing that they're doing in Ukraine from happening. And of course, the Nazi imagery is one that goes back in history in Russia, because of course, the sacrifice that Russians made during the Second World War, they lost 25 million people fighting the Nazis. And so it's sort of in everybody's history and their blood that Nazis are bad, we need to fight Nazis, etc. And so he portrayed them as Nazis. Now, what's so absurd about that is that Zelensky is Jewish. So he's according to them, he's a Jewish Nazi. And of course, they're not Nazis. I mean, I'm sure that there are far-right people in Ukraine, as there are far-right people in Russia, as there are far-right people in America doing Nazi salutes and so on. But the Ukrainian regime is not Nazi. Zelensky is Jewish. The former prime minister of Ukraine was Jewish. It's an absurdity to call them Nazis. But that was the way he sort of whipped the Russians into somewhat of a frenzy, saying that we have to launch this war against these terrible people.
Does Donald Trump really want this war to end?
Well, I'm not even sure what Donald Trump's reasons are at all. He for some reason, and it still doesn't make sense to me, it became sort of a cause célèbre among a certain group of people in the very far right of the U.S. political establishment to somehow say that Ukraine were the bad guys and Russia were the good guys. And this propaganda that was supported by Tucker Carlson, by Elon Musk, by Marjorie Taylor Greene, by Lauren Boebert, and a few others, was sort of floating around in the extreme. It wasn't really a mainstream thing. American people all think that Putin is a bad guy. Almost all Republicans, other than those people I just named, think Putin is a bad guy. But among this very narrow group of people, they think that Putin is a good guy and that Zelensky is a bad guy and Ukraine are the evil ones, not the Russians. And so that was the basis for which Donald Trump has been sort of running with this whole thing. But it's sort of perplexing why Donald Trump wouldn't look at the majority of U.S. public opinion as opposed to this very narrow minority of individuals who have this position.
Because this goes back, I mean, there is history here, as far back as the Steele dossier and the Mueller report. And Trump has vehemently denied any connection or relationship with Russia. But you read those reports and you understand the rhetoric, and it's just simply not true. And in fact, why would he be pushing so hard to distance himself from these things if there wasn't a story there? What, in your opinion, is the real story? Because people talk about compromat and the PP tape and various things. I personally think it's more to do with the fact that he just really puts Putin on a pedestal and needs to pay him back for helping him get elected in 2016. Where do you sit with this?
Well, the answer is that we don't know. So first of all, Mueller did a very, very detailed investigation, and I do a lot of public speaking, and I often ask people to raise their hands in the audience how many people have actually read the Mueller report. Nobody has, but I have. Yeah. And the Mueller report has all sorts of approaches by people who worked for Donald Trump to the Russians, and there's all sorts of approaches by the Russians to people in the Trump campaign, and in fact, a number of people were found guilty of different types of crimes connected to the Mueller report. And so, but Robert Mueller came up with a conclusion that he didn't want to prosecute Trump, and as a result, Trump threw his hands in the air and said, "This is the Russian hoax." And he's been repeating those words, the Russian hoax, and anyone who talks about this from then on suffers from Trump derangement syndrome, and there is nothing there, there's no Russian thing, etc. And now all of a sudden there's this huge Russian thing. There's a huge Russian thing where all of a sudden Trump is giving away the store to Putin after all this talk of Russian hoax. And in my mind, it doesn't even matter why he's doing it. All that matters is he is doing it. And it's wrong that he is attacking Ukraine, attacking Zelensky, publicly humiliating him in front of the whole world, and then praising Putin. It's just wrong. And there's all sorts of implications for that. And I sit here in Europe. There's dramatic implications for the United Kingdom and the European Union and Ukraine on what to do about this. Should the eventuality come that the U.S. completely abandons Ukraine, which, as a betting man, I would say that that's the more likely outcome.
The U.S. senators are, and certainly Democratic senators, are asking questions in the Senate. Is Donald Trump a Russian asset? I would say that he's almost too stupid to be an asset, but he kind of is doing everything that an asset would do, and that's kind of what they concluded, that it doesn't really matter. He is still handing Putin everything that Putin wants, and certainly the Russian state media suggested that after that phone call, Putin was thrilled with the outcome of that. What is your? I don't want this to be a conspiracy conversation, but what is your take on that?
I have no idea whether he's what his motivations are, and the one thing I can say, but before I became a human rights activist, I was an investor. I spent many decades investing, and as an investor, what I learned is that everybody always behaves rationally. There's no such thing as irrational behavior, at least at high levels. And so if somebody does something which doesn't make sense, and this is something that doesn't make sense on the surface, then it just means you don't have all the information, because if we had all the information, we'd be able to explain it. What is that information? I don't know. And eventually we all will know, because there's no secrets in the world. Eventually everything comes out. But in the short term, what I do know is that we're in a bad place. The United States voted with Russia, North Korea, and Iran against a resolution at the United Nations calling Russia the invader and Ukraine the victim. that's all you need to know. I mean, that says everything right then and there. And why they're doing it, we don't know, and we're probably not going to know for some time until it all comes out. But we have to deal with this in the meantime, which is what do we do about this? How do we prevent the world from turning upside down? Which is, as a person who specializes in Russia, that's my biggest objective right now.
So let's talk to Europe for a moment, because European leaders are scrambling to reposition their military, to invest in military. They got told at the Munich Security Conference by J.D. Vance that the US wouldn't be necessarily giving the security guarantees to the EU as it always has, since the Transatlantic Alliance in 1941. So there is clearly a concern in the world community that Donald Trump is on the wrong side of history here, and he is likely to let this war play out and probably not provide the support and the security guarantees that Zelensky wants going forward. Is it the case that European leaders recognize the threat of fascism more than others just by nature of history?
Well, I mean, everybody in Europe is living in a state of crisis right now. When I say everyone in Europe, the leaders are living in a state of crisis right now. The speech that J.D. Vance gave at the Munich Security Conference, the speech that the Defense Secretary Pete Hegseth gave at the NATO gathering a few days before that. Yeah. And then, of course, the horrific Oval Office confrontation with Zelensky all has led everybody in Europe to say that America is probably going to stop supporting Ukraine. And America did for a few days in terms of military aid and in terms of intelligence aid. And the logical conclusion from that is that America may, and it's not a certainty, may no longer play the role of being the guarantor of peace in Europe as part of NATO. And of course, there's also the talk about the possibility of U.S. troops being redeployed from Europe to other places. And so it's a complete game changer as far as Europe is concerned. And this is probably the one place where I would agree with Trump that, there's no reason why Europe shouldn't have paid more money for their own defense than they have. And so now, with a taste of bitter medicine, Europe is now woken up. And now, of course, there's going to be unforeseen consequences for the United States about this whole wake-up call. Now, Germany has allocated €1 trillion to rebuilding their defense. And so we're going to now have a militarized Germany, whatever that may mean. Of course, the UK is increasing their defense spending now by 25% and then by another 25% in 2027 and on and on and on. And so there's going to be a massive amount of rearming of Europe, which is not a bad thing because Europe probably should take care of itself. But it's interesting that one of the fears that the Europeans now have is that that if they have purchased U.S. weapons and the U.S. doesn't want them holding Russia's feet to the fire, they could basically use the kill switch, right, and turn off a missile or turn off an F-16 or an F-35 jet, or not supply the spare parts or whatever it is that they do. And so all of a sudden, all sorts of military orders from the United States have dried up, and the Canadians and the Danes and all sorts of other people that were thinking about Portuguese, all these people thinking about buying U.S. jets and weapons are all now saying, where do we find these things? Because we don't want to be having somebody turn off our capabilities in the middle of a war.
And that even goes for the stuff that they've already purchased, right? Because the tech support, I was reading about the reconnaissance data from some of these planes. The US owns that data, and part of the contract is that obviously they get access to it, but they can turn that off. So the tech support goes away. This is a serious problem, not just for the kind of militarily, but also economically from the US. It's a huge part of the US's exports.
Yeah, I would be really mad at Trump right now if I was the head of General Dynamics or right. Northrop Aviation or whoever these companies are, because all of a sudden they're probably going to lose an enormous amount of business from this whole thing. And the Europeans, when they came up with this decision to do joint purchasing of weapons, which is different than the German decision. This is a European decision, $150 billion decision. They said that all the purchases have to be done within Europe, no outside Europe. And I think that at least one industry is going to be really upset with Trump for creating this uncertainty, and that's the military-industrial complex.
Let's just talk to Putin's demands for a moment, because it appeared to me that they hadn't really changed from before this perfect phone call. He's really steadfast on the fact that he does not want Ukraine to join NATO, and that he doesn't want there to be any kind of support from the US. How did you think Putin's strategy had changed through this phone call versus what he's been saying for the last 2 years?
Putin's strategy hasn't changed 1 centimeter from 2 months before the war until now. His main objective is for the total capitulation and surrender of Ukraine. He wants Ukraine to be part of Russia. And of course, he's very happy to terrorize all the Ukrainians that defied him. All the women will be raped, all the men will be murdered and tortured, and all the children will be kidnapped. And so the Ukrainians are fighting a just war, and a war that any normal Ukrainian would rather fight than surrender. And I think this is the thing that nobody seems to understand outside of Ukraine, is that as tired as they are of this war, they would rather not have the alternative, which is to be completely going to hell under Russian occupation. And it's not really our place to try to force on them some type of unbelievable, terrible surrender, which would lead to those consequences.
What do you think of this kind of mineral wealth deal that was floated? And that's now changed to even include Trump saying, well, we're going to own your energy or your nuclear power stations or something. I mean, we said at the beginning that it seemed pretty woolly, but this was used as a bargaining chip with Zelensky, wasn't it? Is it that Trump wants to walk away from this deal and at least be able to say to the American people, well, at least we got the minerals or the rare earth, as he calls it, and at least we now have access to these power stations?
Well, so first of all, let me just give you a little bit of background. I spent a good part of my life as the largest foreign investor in the former Soviet Union. And so the main objective of my life when I was doing that was to look around for economic opportunities where I could be an investor. And there was lots of interesting opportunities. Most of them were in Russia because that's where most of the money and resources were. There was oil and gas and nickel and aluminum and so on. And there are much, much fewer economic opportunities in Ukraine. But to the extent that there were opportunities in Ukraine, never once in multi-decades when I was looking at this, that rare earth minerals in Ukraine ever came up as a topic. Never once. Now, rare earth minerals exist in lots of places. And the way that you decide whether you want to get them out of these places is you look at how much it costs to get them out, how long it's going to take you, and then you say, if I'm going to get this stuff in 10 years' time, what's the value of those cash flows in 10 years today? And the riskier a place is, the lower the value is today. And so I can say pretty confidently that there is no real economic opportunity for rare earth metals or minerals in Ukraine. And when Trump set Scott Bessent, the Secretary of Treasury, for the first go round on this thing, they said that we want America wants the ports and the oil wells and all sorts of stuff that's currently economically producing. And Zelensky was so angry, and I wasn't in the meeting, but I heard what happened after the meeting, that Scott Bessent was shaking. He had, he was dealing with a warrior, okay, a guy who said, I don't want to get on the helicopter on the day the war started. I don't need transportation. I need ammunition. And Scott Bessent he probably wasn't ready to deal with that kind of character. But Zelensky told him what was what, and he probably went back and cried in the White House. But eventually, a piece of paper was produced, which was called a framework agreement. And the framework agreement said that at some date in the future, a more specific agreement would come to, which would be including an agreement about who puts in what, how, where to do these rare earth minerals. And so it was basically an agreement to agree something which probably doesn't exist. And so I don't know what that really is. And of course, nobody's talking about that anymore. If you sort of look at what's being talked about and what isn't being talked about, that was sort of this weird passing fancy of Trump's. And I think you're right. I think the main reason he threw that out there was he threw out some exaggerated figure of how much money America gave to Ukraine. And then he threw out some even more exaggerated figure about how much money America was going to get back with this rare earth minerals. And therefore what a great deal it was going to be. But I think the whole thing was kind of a red herring from the very beginning.
Well, he couldn't even remember what rare earth was. He called it raw earth 3 times during that meeting, which shows how much interest he seems to take in this. But Trump is trying to position Zelensky as the aggressor in American media. There was he's pulled back on that a little bit now because there was pushback. But he was genuinely trying to rewrite the narrative and have the American people think that Russia was the good guy and Zelensky was the aggressor, and even asking Zelensky to agree to a ceasefire, was just laughable.
Well, of course. The whole thing is I think laughable is very generous. I think it was really offensive. That,
yeah.
It was gaslighting in the extreme. That every American watched Russia invade. Everyone saw it on their television. Russia accumulated their troops on the border, and then those troops crossed the border. I don't know how you can somehow characterize that as Ukraine starting the war. Ukraine didn't do anything, and that was, of course, just a terrible way of characterizing the situation. And then, of course, there was this statement after that Zelensky is a dictator, and that Zelensky only had 4% approval rating, which of course is not true. He has, since all that, his approval ratings have gone through the roof. He's probably the most popular person in Ukraine, particularly after that Oval Office meeting. But these are all talking points that you could hear straight out of Russia that are being repeated by the most powerful man in the free world, the President of the United States.
So, as I see it, Trump would just... Because he did say during that meeting, otherwise you guys are just going to have to fight it out. And to me, that was a very telling sentence, because I guess that's really what Trump wants. He doesn't want to have anything to do with this. He wants it to play out. He probably wants Russia to win. Originally, as a real estate guy, he was like, okay, you can have this territory and you can have that territory and I'll develop some property on this one. That's kind of along similar lines to what Putin was saying about, he wants Crimea to be recognized as Russian territory, officially. Cahoots is the word that kind of comes to mind because they do seem to be singing off a very similar hymn sheet.
Well, so the thing that perplexes me about this whole thing is that Trump kept on repeating over and over again during the campaign, I'm going to solve this war in 24 hours. Biden should have never let it start. I wouldn't do it if it had been me. And he kept on repeating that over and over and over again. And so he's kind of got, an investment in the resolution of this thing, because there's not a person in America that doesn't remember him saying that, because he said it so many times. And so I'm not sure that he wants the war to go on. He wants it to end, I think, so he can fulfill his self-confident promise that he could end the war. But the only way there's only one way to end the war, which is if Putin is not ready to stop the war, then the only thing he can do is force surrender on Ukraine, which is what he's been doing. And now, of course, on the other hand, that goes so against American public opinion that he's got to find a way to thread the needle if he really wants to do that. And I think that's what all this sort of strange, rope-a-dope, meetings that they're having, where Putin is saying, well, let's set up a specialized task force to discuss this and so on and so forth. You don't need specialized task forces or anything like that. All you need is Putin to stop invading, but he doesn't want to stop invading. And so the only alternative is for him to win the war, which Trump could, if he wanted to, play a role in helping Putin do.
I mean, the sheer fact that Zelensky wasn't even invited to the talks in the Middle East is quite telling, isn't it?
Well, so here you have a country which has said it wants to be the mediator, wants to be the solver of this war, wants to end the war. And you have two parties in the war. You have the Russians who invaded, and you have the Ukrainians who were the victims who were invaded. And so it would stand to reason that if you were trying to end the war, you would try to put both people in a room, or maybe you put them in separate rooms. And you go from one room to the other and back and forth, and you try to find a way to find an agreement that they could end the war. But if you just have yourselves and the invader having a meeting, there's only one thing you can say to the invader to end the war, which is stop invading. But that doesn't. I've never heard those words. He's not said those words. He's not said Russia should stop invading. They should withdraw. I've never heard those words coming out of Trump. And so there's he's not put any pressure on Putin. He's not criticized Putin. He certainly hasn't berated him in the Oval Office or elsewhere. And so we're in this strange situation where if there really is an intention to end this war, it's not being well played out at the moment.
There are other clues, Bill, to Donald Trump's allegiance, aren't there? Things like preventing the International Criminal Court from investigating Putin and the origins of the war, and the intelligence sharing you mentioned, stopping that, although they've restarted that now, finally. And other things too, like not taking part in this ledger of an investigation as to how many Ukrainian children were kidnapped from Ukraine and taken to Russia. I mean, it's over 40,000, I think, now. I mean, all of this stuff is further evidence that if Trump hadn't written that executive order saying that he doesn't recognize the ICC, he clearly knew that they would want to investigate him too, because he is absolutely a part of the extension of this war, if anything.
Well, so I'm looking at all this stuff and I'm saying to myself, okay, this is pretty shocking, but what more is he going to do? And the things that I'm most afraid of going forward are the lifting of sanctions. So right. Everybody has said in Russia, well, the sanctions don't matter. Look how well we're doing. But the reality is that Russia is on its knees economically. It's really having terrible problems. And they're desperate for the sanctions to be lifted. And one of the first things that was intimated after the meeting in Riyadh, the first meeting in Riyadh between Marco Rubio and Foreign Minister of Russia, Lavrov, was the possibility of lifting sanctions, which, if that were to happen, I think it would really be a game changer for Putin, because all of a sudden, this stranglehold would have been lifted. And so up until now, the things that have happened are pretty distasteful. For example, they disbanded the Klepto Capture Task Force, which was set up at the Department of Justice to prosecute Russian oligarchs. As you mentioned, they got rid of the division of the U.S. government, which is helping identify and repatriate kidnapped Ukrainian children from Russia.
They cancelled cybersecurity as well on Russia, but not on China. So strange.
So those things are bad, but they're not determinative. But lifting sanctions, if they were to do that, and I'm sitting on the edge of my seat waiting to see if that's going to happen, would be determinative. That would then completely change the game for Russia and give them the breathing room they need to really go at it hard, much harder than they have been so far, because they wouldn't be financially constrained. And so that's what I'm most worried about right now is them doing that. And of course they're offering all these things up, and it's interesting because Putin is saying, we want to have all sorts of meetings to discuss lots of things with you. And what they want to discuss with the Russians, what they want to discuss with the Trump administration is not ending the war. They want to discuss lifting the sanctions. They want to discuss normalizing relations. They want to discuss all the things that not providing military aid to Ukraine. Those are the types of things that they want to discuss. And I just hope that whatever's motivating Trump, that he doesn't agree to those things, because that will be a terrible, terrible thing for Ukraine.
Well, this $5 million gold visa that Trump mentioned, which he sees as a revenue generator. I don't know how many he thinks he's going to sell. But he was asked, couldn't Russian oligarchs buy this and get citizenship eventually through this kind of special gold version of a green card? And he was like, well, yeah. And in fact, I've met some oligarchs and some of them are very nice people. I mean, he wasn't even denying it when asked flat out. This is really a drip, drip, drip towards the end game where Putin and Trump stand shoulder to shoulder as the leaders of the world.
Well, so it's interesting because I don't know where the red lines are on this thing, but I can imagine, based on just my own interpretation, that the American people wouldn't be standing for that. I mean, that could be a red line. I don't think that he can, go to the Victory Day parade in Moscow and come back to rapturous applause in Washington. I think Americans are smarter than that, and they understand what's going on. And so he's got to play this more subtly than that if he wants to sort of do these favors for Putin. And so the subtle way to do it is little things that most people aren't going to pay attention to. The United Nations vote, the disbanding of this task force going after the oligarchs. But I don't know, where the line is, but there is a line, and there's a line that American people won't tolerate. Russia has been the evil empire. That's in everybody's DNA. People aren't going to forget about that, no matter how many times he said he had a perfect meeting and he trusts Vladimir Putin.
Just explain a little more about sanctions, because it's a word that we hear a lot, but I don't think people really understand what it means. I know you have a lot of experience in this area. How does it affect Russia currently to have these sanctions imposed upon it?
Well, so sanctions is a very broad term. It's like calling food. It's like, there's all sorts of different types of food. So in the sanctions world, there are many different types. And the first and most significant thing that was done on sanctions was the West froze more than half of Russian government central bank reserves. And so it was more than $300 billion of money that belonged to the Russian government that was held in the West was frozen. And that money continues to be frozen. That was a big hit. The next thing that the U.S. and the rest of the world did was they basically put a sanction in place to say that no Western investors, financial institutions, pension funds, banks, could buy or invest in or lend money to Russian institutions. They couldn't buy bonds. So the capital markets are closed. Then the sanctions were to cut off Russia's access to SWIFT, which is the international payment system. So Russians couldn't pay for stuff. And then the sanctions were to cut off the flow of goods that Russia could use in their military industrial complex. And so all of a sudden, they can't get spare parts for their planes. They can't get parts to make cars and all sorts of other things like that. And then, of course, there was the sanctions on the oligarchs, which was to say that if you were an oligarch close to Vladimir Putin, your money was frozen. And so a lot of money has been frozen all over the world that belonged to these oligarchs. And the reason why that's significant is that in my analysis, the oligarchs are holding Vladimir Putin's money for him. And so when you see an oligarch's assets frozen, it means Putin's money is frozen. And there's and on and on and on. I could go on. So there's a lot of different types of sanctions. Different sanctions have different effects. Some of these sanctions are really painful for them. Some of them are not. But overall, when you put it all together, it puts Russia in a very weak position. They're suffering, and it would be, sort of made up to say that they're not suffering. And of course, Putin wants everyone to think they're not suffering because he can experience 100 times the pain that we can experience before we start complaining. And so he's saying to us, "We're not suffering, but you're suffering. Why are you doing this stuff to yourself?" Hoping that we'll then say, "Well, we shouldn't be doing it. We'll lift the sanctions." So I look at the sanctions story as literally like half the game. If we lift sanctions, then he's got his money, and if he has his money, he can do a lot of things, a lot of terrible things, and the world becomes a much more dangerous place.
We have to take a quick break, but when we come back, I want to talk about how it appears that Trump is trying to align the US with Russia when it comes to the authoritarianism and the dictatorship that he is clearly running. We'll do that next here on The Weekend Show. Let's be real. 2025's been all about change, whether it's work, personal stuff, or just the daily grind. It can be hard to keep up. But here's the deal. When things get hectic, we don't have to go through it alone. Embrace the power of nature and elevate your everyday with Via. Trusted by over 500,000 happy customers, Via is the Swiss Army knife of wellness, dedicated to harnessing the natural benefits of hemp to create high-quality wellness products. Whether you're looking to improve your sleep, focus, or recovery, Via has something for you. Via is well-renowned for their highest quality hemp, sourced from trusted, independently owned American farms. And the best part, Via legally ships to nearly all states in the US in discreet packaging directly to your door with a worry-free guarantee, no medical card required. So, if you're 21 plus, check out our link to Via's website in our description and use code WEEKEND for 15% off. And if you're new to Via, get a free gift of your choice. That's 15% off with the code WEEKEND. So, it's a new year, 2025, and you're thinking, how am I going to make this year different? Am I going to build something for myself? I'm dying to be my own boss, or see if I can turn this business idea I've been kicking around into a reality. But I just don't know how to make it happen. Shopify is how you're going to make it happen, and let me tell you how. The best time to start your new business is right now, and Shopify makes it simple to create your brand, open for business, and get your first sale. Get your store up and running easily with thousands of customizable templates, no coding or design skills required. All you need to do is drag and drop. Their powerful social media tools let you connect all of your channels and create shoppable posts to help you sell everywhere that people scroll. Shopify makes it easy to manage your growing business. They help with the details like shipping, taxes, and payments from one single dashboard, allowing you to focus on the important stuff like growing your business. With Shopify, your first sale is closer than you think. Established in 2025, has a nice ring to it, doesn't it? Sign up for your $1 per month trial period at shopify.com/weekend, all lowercase. Go to shopify.com/weekend to start selling with Shopify today. That's shopify.com/weekend. We're back on The Weekend Show with Sir William Browder. I'm Anthony Davis. Bill, let's talk about the changes that we've seen in the United States since Trump was elected, because it's clear that he puts dictators like Vladimir Putin on a pedestal. He's a little bit in love with Kim Jong-un, talks about Xi Jinping with, great respect, but then again, at the same time, there's this kind of argument over trade. So there's a lot of contradiction, but it does seem that with the policies that are being imposed on the American people, that we are becoming more and more like Russia every single day. Do you think that's fair to say?
Well, it's going to take a long way for America to become like Russia. I mean, Russia is really a very, very bad place. And so, so what does Putin do? Putin has, over the period of 25 years, he has terrorized the media to such an extent. And when I say terrorize, they kill journalists, they imprison journalists, and they exile journalists. And so there is nobody in the media that writes about Putin anymore, because it's just, you can't do it. There was a fractious parliament when Putin first came to power. And he basically created a situation where everybody in parliament, even the opposition, effectively reported to him. And so parliament then doesn't review what the government does. The court system, they basically threatened a few judges, perhaps killed a few. And so judges just wait for the phone call in any political case, wait for the phone call from the Kremlin for how to make a decision. And then if you're a Russian opposition politician like Alexei Navalny or Boris Nemtsov, they kill you. And so nobody wants to become an opposition politician. So that's the Russian version. And as a result, Putin then can be a dictator, a proper, full-on totalitarian dictator. We're a million miles away from that in the United States. But if it becomes too scary to be a judge, if at the moment judges are being threatened with impeachment, and I'm sure that's not very nice when Elon Musk is funding Republican members of Congress to impeach judges. But if it comes to the point where judges are being arrested, then that could have a very bad impact on that. When all of a sudden there's a couple law firms that are being targeted by Trump. If law firms are not willing to represent clients to stand up to the government, then you have another leg being kicked out. And then, of course, if they start to do things to the media, let's say they take away broadcasting licenses for television stations, or they start arresting journalists on trumped up cases, or they deport journalists that are not American citizens, that could also have a dampening effect. And there's a lot of instincts here that are in the wrong direction. But I mean, it's really important to understand that we're a million miles away from Russia, and there's a lot of different things. There's a lot of different ways in which the system and the guardrails could still be used, but it really very much depends on individuals' collective resistance to some of this stuff.
The guardrails have already failed, though. Here it seems like the last-ditch attempt to protect people from the dictatorship is the courts. And as you said, we're now hearing from Trump saying, well, this particular judge is a radical liberal, or just stuff that is plainly untrue, but also trying to shut down cases. And we've also passed the constitutional crisis point, which is where Trump defies court orders, such as when these Venezuelan supposedly gang members were taken off in a C-17 back to Venezuela, despite the court saying that they had to turn around and come back to the US. Another example is a French scientist who was on his way to a conference in the US, was denied entry by customs over messages found on his phone that criticized Trump's science cuts. And this is being reported by Le Monde in France. This guy's a space researcher and was randomly selected upon arrival in Houston. They looked at his phone and they are claiming that he's a terrorist because he criticized Donald Trump. I mean, I appreciate that we're not anywhere near where it's at with Russia, with the killing of Alexei Navalny. But that has to start somewhere. And many of us feel like it's starting now.
Well, the intentions are there, as you've just pointed out. But this is early days. So these guys have had 4 years to set up all they pre-wrote all their executive orders. They plotted everything out. And the United States, citizens of the United States, and the people who didn't want this to happen have had 56 days to figure out how to respond. And I wouldn't throw in the towel and say, and surrender. I mean, there's plenty of opportunities. We haven't seen the end of this whole story about the sort of alleged gang members, which weren't sent to Venezuela. They were sent to El Salvador to go into that horrific prison. Many of whom probably weren't gang members. I was reading about one of them who was a barber.
That's
who just happened to have tattoos. Another one was a LGBT person who happened to have some other tattoos. And so, to have all your rights taken away, let's see how this plays itself out, because I don't think that this judge is backing down. And I can't imagine that as this case gets appealed up to the higher courts and the Supreme Court, that many judges, even in a Trump-stacked Supreme Court, are going to rule in favor of just taking away people's rights. If that's the case, then nobody has any rights.
But a lot of people are very scared. Americans are scared for their free speech being taken away. But of course, naturalized citizens, as well as green card holders and people here on work visas, I mean, there's millions of them. And there is fear. And that fear, you can draw direct comparisons with people not being able to speak out about Vladimir Putin in Russia.
Well, that's absolutely correct, and probably the majority of people are scared. But having lived in a dictatorship, an evolving dictatorship, there's plenty of people in Russia that were ready to speak out, and I'm sure there's many Americans who are ready to speak out. And so there's a lot of people that want America to continue to be a country with a rule of law, that want America to be a country where freedom of speech exists, want a country where the checks and balances are present, and there's some who don't. And but I would say that the average American probably does. And I was reading a poll, I think it was an ABC News poll, where they were asking people about court orders and is it okay to defy court orders? And I think it's 85 or 87% of people said it's not okay, including a vast majority of Republicans who might have been Trump supporters as well. I think that this is something that most Americans feel pretty strongly about.
We're starting to hear that part of the reason why Republicans are not standing up and seeking to impeach Trump, or at least stand with Democrats to stand up for rights and free speech in America, is because they're scared. They're also scared of Donald Trump. They're scared of being primaried. They're scared of being humiliated. But we've also seen reports that some are actually scared for their lives and for the lives of their own families. I mean, again, this is straight out of, Dictatorship 101. And to me, these are the things that we're not hearing enough about. I mean, I'm sure there's a whole other conversation about Trump that goes on privately in these Republican legislatures circles that never really go public, but they are terrified.
Well, and it's that fear that allows dictators to get away with it. But again, I would stress that however afraid certain people are, there are other people who are not afraid, and I know a lot of them, and they're not, they will, use the tools that exist in the American system, whether it's media tools, legal tools, legislative tools, and other tools, to keep the democracy and freedoms alive in America. And I wouldn't underestimate those people, and it doesn't take a lot of those people to actually work. The vast majority of people can be scared. Most people were scared of Putin. I wasn't scared of Putin. There's not that many of me, but I achieved a lot in terms of shutting him down and causing him pain, getting his assets frozen around the world. And so you don't need the whole country to stand up. You just need a few brave people and a few people to support them.
Let's go back to something we haven't really discussed, but it was the kind of flashpoint for this whole topic, which was the Oval Office meeting. That ricocheted around the world, didn't it? I mean, that was a line in the sand for a lot of people, certainly for a lot of Europeans, to see a leader of a sovereign nation be berated by the leader of the free or the formerly free world. Reconstruct these sentences a little. But this really exposed Donald Trump's desire to almost play act the role of a strongman. Because, he is quite cowardly when pressed. But this was an opportunity with J.D. Vance and Brian Glenn, I think it was, Marjorie Taylor Greene's boyfriend, doing that one-liner about why aren't you wearing a suit, that really changed the dynamic for this war in Ukraine and for America's relationship with Europe going forward.
Well, in my opinion, it was probably as painful as it was to watch, and as angry as I was to watch Zelensky being so mistreated. It's probably the best thing that ever happened to Ukraine in a certain way, because everybody who was even sitting on the fence, I mean, there's not a single person I know anywhere in the world that watched that didn't have unbelievable sympathy for Vladimir Zelensky. Yeah. It's like watching, two bullies in the schoolyard trying to pick on the little kid. Who do you sympathize with, the bullies or the little kid? I mean, everybody sympathized with Vladimir Zelensky. And what happened after that in Europe were a bunch of emergency meetings. Keir Starmer, the British Prime Minister, then gathered up all the allies from across Europe. And by the way, Britain had this very strained relationship with Europe, and all of a sudden everybody forgot about Brexit, and we're all magical, all getting together. All these restrictions on how much you're going to spend on defense throw right out the window. Best thing that ever happened to Europe. Got everybody, out of their slumber. Got anybody who wasn't supporting Zelensky supported Zelensky. In Ukraine, if he had a 52% approval rating, it went up to 75%. And so, of course, it was terrible and humiliating and made everybody. I mean, I felt for him like everybody felt for him. But that was probably when people overplay their hand like that, like Trump and J.D. Vance did, I think they were giving a huge gift to Zelensky.
So let's talk about Volodymyr Zelensky for a moment and your thoughts on him, because he really is being held up now as one of the great leaders of this generation. A guy who started as a comic actor. I mean, his show's still on Netflix. I've watched it. He's brilliant. He was the voice of Paddington in the Ukrainian language. I mean, this guy is fun, he's versatile, but clearly he is a patriot and extremely capable as a leader, both military leader and, domestically. What are your thoughts on him?
Well, it's interesting because when he first came to power, he succeeded a guy named Petro Poroshenko. And Poroshenko was really, this is before the war, well before the war started, before the full-scale invasion started, I should say. The war started in 2014, but Poroshenko was really a tough guy, and he was angry with what Russia was doing and taking Crimea and in eastern Ukraine, and was very, very sort of forthright. And Zelensky came in, he beat Poroshenko, he became the president, and he had this original pitch, which is, wouldn't it be great if we got along with Russia? And so I thought, oh my God, Russia found their patsy. And I didn't know whether he was a good guy or a bad guy, but I kind of had suspicions. And then the war started. And there was this moment when, the Americans offered him, transportation, helicopter ride to safety. And he was on the street, and everyone will remember that image of, him on the street with his iPhone, doing a video, as Kiev was being bombed, saying, I don't need transportation, I need ammunition. And then he has used the emotional intelligence that he has as an actor to go around the world. And Ukraine is a poor country. Ukraine doesn't have anywhere near the military resources to fight off of a major, well-resourced attacker like Russia. And he used his charm, his persuasion, his emotional intelligence to convince parliaments, Congress, everyone to give him weapons and give him money to fight off the Russians. And a war that should have lasted 3 days, according to Putin and according to the CIA, is now 3 years and 2 months into it. And they've held them back. They've held the Russians back. And I mean, it's a miracle. Yeah. And it's a miracle that could have only been done by this particular individual. I can't imagine anyone else doing what he did. And so, in the history books, they're going to write about this unbelievable, heroic character, Volodymyr Zelensky. Nobody can take that away from him. And to beat up on a hero like that is what made that so much more of an offensive meeting at the Oval Office.
Punching down is never a good look, is it? Zelensky's come up with this rather genius idea to manufacture these little drones that are causing all sorts of problems for the Russians, where they can send these weaponized drones onto the front line. Is that something that's come from him, or is what? Because Ukrainians are very smart, very capable with technology, but it really does seem. I watched a documentary of them constructing these things, and it really did seem like it was going on in the back of someone's kitchen.
Well, I mean, I remember when the war started, these old grandmas were preparing Molotov cocktails. Yes. I mean, so it's a completely different story to be invaded than to be doing the invading. The Russian soldiers that were invading didn't know why they were invading, didn't care about it. They were just doing it because it was their, they were being ordered to. But the Ukrainians, every single one of them was saying, "How do I defend our country?" And as you mentioned, they're very technologically astute. There are many programmers and technology people in Ukraine, and they discovered that a $500 drone could destroy a $3 million tank. And that is, and by the way, they've changed the nature of warfare, not just in this war, but for everybody else's war everywhere. Ukraine didn't have a navy. The Russians had the Black Sea Fleet, and using drones, sea drones, they've destroyed somewhere between a quarter and a third the Black Sea Fleet, and the Russians are so scared that they've relocated all their ships so it's out of harm's way as far as Ukraine is concerned. They without a navy, they've pushed them back. And so this is the ultimate David and Goliath story, where Ukraine, because they care so profoundly, because it's their survival that's at stake, they're going to try every possible way to fight off this invading force. And as you mentioned, I think they're producing somewhere around 3 or 4 million drones a year, and it's become basically a complete meat grinder for anybody on the Russian side that tries to push forward into their territory, and they just get killed. And the deaths that Russian soldiers are experiencing are between 1,000 and 1,500 soldiers per day. And just to put this in perspective, the total number of American casualties in Iraq in the entirety of the Iraq war was 15,000. That would be 2 weeks of this war for the Russians in Ukraine.
And of course, we're seeing the North Korean soldiers as well now, who have formed an alliance with Putin and are also there. How much of a problem is that, just when we talk about nations and their nuclear capabilities, that Kim Jong has kind of cemented his allegiance and alliance with Vladimir Putin?
Well, it's a big problem and something that people aren't talking about, which is that Putin has been running out of soldiers. He's losing 1,000 to 1,500 a day. They've burned through all the conscripts. They've burned through all the career soldiers. They've burned through all the convicts that they let out of prison to join the army. They've burned through all the people who they're paying sign-on bonuses of 4,000, now going up to 40,000. And so they ended up with the having to beg the Koreans. But what no one's talking about is what are they going to do for the Koreans? The Koreans are trying to build a nuclear program. Are they going to hand over nuclear stuff to them? Because God help us if they do that. And I don't see how that wouldn't be part of the deal.
Well, maybe Putin will give him an Elton John CD and that'll just make everything go away. That's my concern, that Trump doesn't quite get the big picture and is, still continuing to give the impression that Ukraine is completely decimated, when in fact Kiev is operating still as a beautiful European city with cafe culture and people just getting on with their lives. Their resolve is exceptional.
And the resolve is exceptional, and they have a lot. They've created their own drone industry. They created their own missile industry, and so I think it's a fantasy to think that somehow even if America withdraws military aid, that they're just going to say, I give up. It's just too much. We're too tired. That's just not going to happen. And I think that's what Trump would like to happen. That's certainly what Putin would like to happen. If that happened, Trump could say, I ended the war. But that's not going to happen. And remember, the Taliban, who had 1/100th of the resources of the Ukrainians, eventually pushed America out of Afghanistan. And so I mean, ultimately, Russia won't succeed in this effort. They'll be, it'll be a nightmare that they could have, that they would have never imagined. It'll be an insurgency that they could have never predicted. But we're so far away from that now. I mean, at the moment, they're still holding the line. Okay, well, it's good to end on a positive note, and I think that there is a huge amount of support for Zelensky and the Ukrainians right around the world. But I'm so grateful to you for your expertise and your explanations. For now, Sir William Browder, thank you for joining the Weekend Show. Thank you.
I'm Anthony Davis. Don't forget to support me and independent journalism at patreon.com/5 Minute News or by joining the 5 Minute News YouTube channel. And I'll come back next Sunday with a brand new special guest and more factual news to discuss on the 5 Minute News Weekend Show with Midas Touch.